Hi, everyone. My name's Lisa, and I'm a leadership coach and human potential geek. I focus on getting more women into the C-suite to bring lasting business and social change. So if this is something that interests you, please make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so that you don't miss a single upload. I'm here today with kick-ass leader, Lilliette Davidson. Hi, Lilliette.
Hi, how
Nice
are
to
you?
see you.
You as
I'm
well,
well.
Lisa.
Great, thank you. Please share with us your title, first of all, and where you're working right now.
Yeah, so you know what? Thank you so much. I just want to, say I love, the opportunity to sit here with you virtually today. Hopefully one day we'll be able to do it one day soon in person. So thank you again for the opportunity to share and storytell. So yeah, currently I'm with Staples Professional, which is the B2B division of Staples Canada, Senior Director of Sales Operations and Customer Service, where I've spent, the majority of my career really between sales and customer service. So yeah, very new in role, 90 days in. I think I just crossed that landmark, this week. And so just, having a blast in the new position.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks so much. So can you give us a little bit of an overview of your career and kind of what has brought you to this point in your journey?
So, you know what, like many, I went to school for one thing and ended up in another thing. I really had no idea, I would say in my early days, mid 20s, what I was good at. And really at the time, I would say what was motivating me was, okay, finish school and time for some more independence, right? And I think my journey has really been through a process of elimination, especially in the first, let's say, 10 years of my career, 5-10 years. So my path, I started off in customer service. It was a friend, hey, get into this pharma company. It's a great place to work. Start in customer service and work your way up. And of course, once you get into that corporate environment, then you sort of check out, what else is here? So I went from, customer service and then into sales management, leadership, right? I enjoy it. So then it was, this desire to kind of continue in sort of the leadership management track. Starting in healthcare was, again, by chance, but I really enjoyed that. So that was a good career industry to get in, very purposeful work for me. And then, at some point, I cut over into operations, so patient services. I think that's where you and I met sort of on that part of my journey. And, I wasn't a clinician or medical professional, but it was sort of an out of box kind of cut over into healthcare, didn't fit the typical mold. And so on, which has been a theme in my whole life. But I stayed on the healthcare track, progressive roles inside of operations and sales. I would say operations really were my heart beats. So I kind of really started pursuing more operational roles as I progressed into, director level, senior director, and then even VP role recently. So yeah, that's kind of been my journey. So very, very, I would say very linear in the sense of sort of went from frontline with increasing responsibilities, then into management, and then sort of pursued that track, but non-linear in the sense that I didn't stay purely in IT or purely in a particular industry like retail. Kind of bumped around, with healthcare, life sciences, pharmaceuticals, healthcare technology even, and sort of, dipped and dabbled in a few different places. But that's brought me here. This is probably the first time in my career of late that I've jumped outside of the healthcare I guess. And, I'm sort of in a whole new industry and loving it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. What I love is that just sort of being open to what's around and what's next and that kind of thing. I used to always be really jealous of people who sort of from childhood knew exactly what they were going to do and just were on that track their
Right.
whole life. And I've learned that there's so much adventure and growth in kind of just going with like, where is it flowing now and that sort of thing. So it sounds like you really embraced that.
And I would say there's, some element of that when you study yoga, on, let's say on the next level beyond just the poses in the studio. There is, lots of talk of, flowing and ebbing with where things are going. Religion does a lot of that as well, and sort of less of that sort of control and really just allowing things to be. So, I think there's a little bit of both for sure in my career path, but certainly, happy that I've, taken that path for sure. Just a little bit of experimentation and process of elimination throughout my career.
Right, right. So what brings you the most joy in your work?
I would say connections. It's kind of, it's almost a bit cliche, but I really enjoy, bringing the best work from teams when, teams honestly thought they had maybe hit their ceiling, or individuals thought they had hit their potential, let's say. And that could be whether, that ceiling or potential in self, or a project or a process. And then, so for me, it's finding that uncovered something and making it come alive again, whether it's a project or whatever. And that's such a fantastic feeling. And so I started by saying connection. And I would say, to me, that's when those connections happen best, because all of a sudden you've again untapped something, you've uncovered something, and then that relationship gets stronger as a result. My confidence builds, their confidence builds, that connection really tightens, and then it almost becomes this desire for the next thing, right? And I just love that. So to me, it's the connection ultimately, but the pathway to get there is amazing.
Awesome. Awesome. I love that. So if you think back to when you first became a leader, like, I think sometimes that connection.
Just yesterday.
Yeah.
I'm still 25.
Yes. When you talk about that connection, and I think there's just something that I sort of see leadership as this noble profession, right? Because I really do think that it's truly connecting and seeing those individuals and really being able to unlock that potential in them and all of that kind of stuff. And that's hard when you first step onto that leadership rung. So I'm just wondering, when you think back to that first rung, what was most challenging for you? What did you find toughest there?
Yeah, so I would say realizing that positive change is still change and can be perceived as negative, or more accurately, can trigger a stress response, which then we know in adults can present in many different ways. I would say, I remember when I was a regional manager, one of my teams was in a small rural community in Ontario. We were given the opportunity to pilot an expansion of scope of practice. So in these roles, I had technicians. And so there was technicians and technologists. So in this particular location, it was technicians. And we were able, for the first time ever, to pilot the expansion of scope, allowing the technicians to do some roles that a technologist would do. So some of the lab testing and doing that. So here's me, right? Newish manager. And, thinking to myself, this is great, right? I feel good about it. And therefore, everyone else will feel good about it. And then wasn't that a shocker, right? To think that because something is perceived as being a positive change, it should land positively with individuals. And I really was convinced. Now in hindsight, and you've gone through, you get 10 more years under your belt or whatever, then you really understand that, there's triggers, and there's, still people grieve losses because, this is how things were for me. And I liked that. Right. And now it's more complex, and you're asking me to do more. And what does that mean? And, how to really to get through that. So I would say, a couple things really piqued my interest at that point. One was change management, knew nothing about it back then. And then sort of neuroscience and leadership, right? People, behaviors. And so I'd say at the time, the challenge was understanding people, rewards creativity versus doubt, stagnation, sort of that and just, making assumptions about what people would like. People like what I like, people will dislike what I dislike, and then not true. So that I would say is, definitely that was the challenge in my early leadership days.
And so how has it shifted now over, like you said, that decade or whatever, right? How has your leadership changed in that time?
I would say things changed for me when I started to apply next. I had applied actually to a next level leadership role or management role. That was kind of a junior entry level. I didn't get the job, and I wasn't necessarily shocked that I didn't get it, but I was certainly intrigued and curious to know, how do I get ready for, the next time this role comes around? And so I remember being advised that I should do some leadership training, right? And at the time, I wasn't really aware of the difference between manager training and leadership training. So I did some homework and kind of started down the path. Leaders thinking ideas, managers executing ideas, leaders inspire people, managers drive their success, that kind of stuff where it's like, oh, okay, there's a difference. And, I spent more time also working on me. And, I think through that process, I learned, there is a leadership shortage, right? And I, again, knowing the difference between, manager and leader. And so that was very compelling to me. So then I realized, okay, leadership training is really important because there is a shortage there. Most people manage, right? And then I would say, I kind of started down the path of, women in leadership and neuroscience and learning about mindfulness and, just the great practices for self and care. And then I think I went on and shifted some of that neuroscience into other people, as I kind of had mentioned, the change side and behaviors, self-regulation. I think that's when I was introduced to the SCARF model, ADKAR for change management, all that. I love that stuff. Obviously, I'm going on and on. Then I would say as time went on, I kind of shifted back to me. Understanding me. So, again, I went through the, manager leadership, just general leadership. So you're kind of doing like Myers-Briggs and DISC and like kind of those things that give you a little bit of awareness of self, motivating people, right? How to build high performing teams. You kind of, everyone goes through some of that, right? So they're into the mindfulness and then the neural side. And then I went back to self-development again. Going back to reflect on DISC and Myers-Briggs 5, 10, 15 years later. And so great, I kept them all, which is kind of cool, but nothing really changed, right? Like my DISC, that I'm a high raging D, high raging I, and then nothing on the SC. And that hasn't changed. But I think that in itself, kind of going back and reflecting, was good learning, but the evolution of, compensatory skills rather, that you develop over time to either enhance or dampen some of your behaviors. Those are things that sort of have changed, right? Like, okay, so I'm a high D. So what does that mean? How does that land? In my early career, maybe not so much, not so great. Now, how do you leverage that? How do you have compensatory elements to balance that off a little bit more? So those are things, again, as I've focused on self. And I think when we start, like the shift really of late is I've been doing this Positive Intelligence by Shirzad Chamine, who's an author and executive coach, and has developed a pretty comprehensive program. As mentioned, he's written a couple of books and so on. And his focus really is about, learning more about self, and how when we take that personal responsibility, that becomes your next generation, understanding your internal judgments and tendencies. And right now, by doing that, you raise all boats in the tide, because you're not triggering other people. People see that positive change in you, they get inspired by that, and it sort of becomes this wave, right? This domino effect. So I've been really this phase, and I'm still in it, in its early days, and just really focusing on self. And I would say now, layering that all on, looking back at, the DISC profiles, the Myers-Briggs, and so on. Now that I've understand some of the internal judgment tendencies I have, I'm hypervigilant, for example. I'm restless, for example. those two things can be strength and a development opportunity, right? They play such key roles in my talent for continuous improvement, for example. That hypervigilance and sort of always needing to kind of go over and make sure all the bases are covered up has played a role in my talent as a continuous improvement leader. My ability to thrive in ambiguity, in fact, in chaos, which many people dislike. I love it. And it's because of that restless quality that I have that allows me to kind of storm and move through things. And together, those two pieces have really created me and my unique talent in leadership. And so I think it's come full circle, at least for me today. And I'm on this continuous journey of learning. So I'm sure I'll have other epiphanies. And I know this is a really long-winded question, but ultimately I'm at a place where I'm working on self, and it's going to be transformative for me. And I would say that that's been kind of my leadership journey and where I'm at right now and how much it's changed in, the last decade, 15 years.
And what I really love about that is that you never do stop learning and growing as a leader. And so women or other marginalized leaders, especially, who put such pressure on themselves to really get it exactly right from the start. It's like none of us are fully formed.
That's right.
Ever. And hopefully, we die not fully formed, right? Because that means we stagnate and we stop growing if we become fully formed and set, right?
Right.
Yeah. So there's something really powerful there. And I love that you embrace that so much. The other thing, you talked about the strengths and those can be weaknesses, right? And that's something that I think sometimes is hard for people to get their head around, right? Because we're led to see them as such different things. And yet, when you recognize that your strengths are what is most extreme about you, most sort of pronounced about you. And so in some circumstances, those are going to be strengths. And in other circumstances, they might not work so well and they might create issues and that kind of thing. I think there's just such power in being able to sort of take that in and embrace that these are strengths and that they can trip you up and that's all okay.
I agree. And I think, again, that comes back to that sort of working on self always, that personal responsibility to self. And I think, that hyper awareness, if you will, or awareness is so important, because when you can learn to kind of channel into other parts of the brain, if you will, that are more on the creative side, and you can learn to harness some of those strengths that you have better. When you stay sort of on that, like the stress side of things, we tell ourselves stories that we believe to be true, right? Like, well, if I wasn't such a hardcore driver, then I wouldn't be where I am today in my career, right? It's a great story to tell yourself. And it's, one that I probably believed for a long time as a female or as a Black female and things like that. And it's, true. And then there's other ways to get there that are more, I've got the sign, sort of be kind, right? There's other ways to tap into creativity and leveraging your strengths through exploration and innovation and, different, other ways to approach it than maybe, my raging D on my DISC score as my only pathway there. So you're right.
So that kind of leads into the next question, because, many of the women that I work with have to expend a lot of energy to prove themselves. And when you are from a marginalized group, there's just that tendency to be seen as less than. And so, I know that need to prove yourself in those situations. I know that that's something you've experienced. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about that experience and what you've learned from it.
Yeah, it's funny because, I'll start first by saying, I was raised, and there's all these intersectionalities that we have and different experiences in our life that shape and form who we are and our and our beliefs, right? And our patterns of thinking and so forth. So, that's, I think a foundation that we all know is true. Growing up as, Jamaican immigrant parents, first generation, I was born here along with the majority of my siblings. There's 4, only girl, 3 boys, mainly white middle-class neighborhood I grew up in. So all things that sort of framed my thinking. And then hearing things from my mother, like, you're going to be, going to university, you're going to finish, don't worry about your brothers because, men always land on their feet, not always the same for women, right? So these are the patterns of thinking that I grew up in, which has made me uber competitive. Right. And so, always having to overachieve, that hyperachiever and hypervigilance I talked about earlier, and so on. Right. So that's kind of my foundation, let's say. So now let's, how does that manifest? So I remember, taking, and I had talked about, I take all these atypical roles. So I moved into a pretty male dominated industry. This was a period of time where I stepped outside of healthcare for a while. I spent about 6 years kind of more in the consumer goods. They did have a healthcare division, but really more consumer. So there was a lot of construction industry. The customer on the other side was construction, development, building. Mm-hmm. So I remember being the national sales manager in that role. 2 things happened. First thing was, I'm going to take a chance on you, Lilliette, because you're the first woman in a long time that I brought into this role. So although the intention was good there, the intention was, I recognize I need to bring more women into the role. The message and how it landed to me was, I'd prefer to have a guy, but I'm going to put you in, right? So it was like, okay. And me, atypical roles, I'll take it. I'm good. I'm up for the challenge. First thing. So here I am in the role. And I remember that same, boss calls me one day and he's frustrated because someone on our team, one of my peers, was pregnant. And he was just like, oh. And I remember for him, it was a stressor, right? What a waste of time for him to now have to recruit and train somebody for, who knows, 6 months or a year. And it was such a drag. And in my head, I'm thinking like, well, did you forget that like your mom gave birth to you? Like you got here because of a woman. Like, did you forget that? But I remember, and that stuck with me. So I think it was like a year or so later, I'm pregnant, right? Mm-hmm. And so I ended up hiding my pregnancy until I was 7 months, and I was on the road. So it was kind of, I didn't have to go into an office every day. So it was kind of easy. I had this fear of disappointing him. I had this fear of remembering how frustrating it was for him to deal with my peer, and knowing it's going to be the same, although he's going to smile and grin and say, congratulations. It wasn't necessarily how he was feeling. And so as a result of that, I remember, giving birth to my middle son at that time, Seamus, and saying, I got to only do 4 months of my maternity leave because I got to get right back to work, because in my mind, I'm like, the world's going to change under my feet. I don't want to be that, I got to fill the role for a year while you're gone kind of person. Right. And, I'm like late 20s at this point. So it's like, okay, this is what I got to do. All great things that, helped me in my career at the time, right? But again, those stories you tell yourself that you believe to be true, there's other pathways I could have gotten there. And I commend the women who spend that time, 18 months to be home. Very, very important time. And I wish I could go back. I can't. Mm-hmm. But still, again, the amount of energy I spent on, realizing A, I was a frustration. It's a drag to get pregnant. B, I was the first female national account manager that he had brought in a long time. And it brought a lot of pressures. And so I spent a lot of energy overthinking, rethinking, maybe changing the course of how I did things, in order to do that. And we know there's this gap exists with women in, leadership, Black women in leadership roles, board roles, pay equity, male dominated industries, like I mentioned, like construction or otherwise. And, we know that just, 8% of the Fortune 500 companies are led by women. And then that drops to 1% when we add, women of color on that as well. So when you talk to women like me who've kind of broken through that ceiling, or the structural disadvantages that exist in biases, it's really cool to kind of see the changes that are happening, because when we look sort of, on the those that are just coming out of college and university now, or high school and so on, and getting into the workforce, we're starting to see some of that shift a little bit. And so the gap is closing somewhat. And, I've learned that, to really get through and beyond this impasse, we definitely have to be intentional. It's not going to happen organically, right? We've seen that because it's moved so slowly up until now. And it's just really cool to see that companies are trying to figure out how to fully leverage, women's talents and breaking down some of those structural barriers that we see. So it's all great things. And I'm really cool. Like even just this, right? Today is part of that change and helping to lead through that. So just really cool beans to see that shift happening today.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting. I mean, the impact of that one, what probably to him was a very small thing that he said, but the spillover and how it impacts decisions and feelings about your place in the workplace and all of that kind of thing. And in some ways it's depressing to hear those things, right? Because like I joke around that I'm a professional feminist. This is what I do, right? And the fact is that, the more that you learn about where we're at now and that kind of thing, the more depressing it is in so many ways. But at the same time, because when you're offered this position and told, you're the first woman that we've hired in this position, it's not only this pressure of, like you're a woman and so somehow I wish that we could have gotten a man in here, but also that weight of, and if you mess up, it doesn't just reflect on you as a person, it reflects on women, on Black women, right? This is how it represents. And so all of that is just, like I said, pretty depressing. And yet it's also, those things have shaped how you grow and how you learn as a leader and what you talk about and what kind of a stand you take. And so in some ways, those experiences contribute to improving things at the same time.
Yeah, I completely agree, right? I think, female, Black, and then on top of that, you've got, your lived experiences as well, right? The voice of my mother on top of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Female in my family, 3 boys. You add those things on as well, and they can be further depressing, to use your word. I've definitely always really just looked at it as an opportunity. I've been one to always try to dare to be different. Challenges excite me, right? That's that hyper competitive side of me. So as much as I know I'm the only female of color on my leadership team today in my new role, I love the fact that my leader is the president, female, Michelle. And so that's great and inspiring. And I've seen her, on stage. She's fantastic. She knows the business well. Her number game is strong. I love it. But yeah, only female person of color. And, sometimes you look around. I've been used to looking around and noticing, right? Oh, look, I'm it, right? But I don't stay there, right? It's a notice. It is what it is. And then how do I leverage? How do I make it an opportunity? How do I, prove to myself I can do it because I know I'm capable of whatever it is, but also allow others to see that as well. So I try not to stay in that sort of depression. I spin out of that pretty quickly and just look at it as it is what it is. And I can be part of the change, part of the solution.
Right. I love that term, like send the elevator back down, right? That kind of thing is, I just love that idea so much. So, if we're thinking about younger women coming up or earlier career women coming up into leadership, what have you done that has most allowed you, like you've touched on a few different things. So I'm wondering if you kind of boil it down to, what have you done that's most allowed you to progress in your career? And what sort of advice would you give to women who are just trying to get into leadership or just starting out in their leadership?
Yeah, it's such an amazing question, because you know what? There's never really one thing, right? And there's probably 40 things, really. Everything's like incremental progress over time. So, I can probably go on forever. There's some good research out there, lots of good research out there that talk about, the need to kind of speak up a little bit more when it comes to roles. For example, it's like, well, I had no idea you were interested in the role, right? Sometimes people will hear that. So you do have to speak up sometimes and let people know that there's an intention and where you want to go. So that's almost like foundational, right? If nobody knows, then how can something present, or how can you be thought of? So that's probably table stakes. I think sometimes we do ourselves a disservice sometimes with job descriptions, right? It's like, okay, what's the superwoman ideal person look like, right? So we have these JDs that have 40 bullets on it, and it's like, and they must have this, and then I want this and this and this. It's like, nobody's built or wired like that, like really. And so what happens is, if sometimes, and we know, like, our male counterparts will look at it and go, oh, there's 40 things there and I've got 15, I'm going to apply. And then the female counterpart will look at that exact same one and go, oh, look, there's 40 things here, I have 15. Oh, like, I don't qualify for the job, right? So we kind of sometimes take ourselves out before the competition even started. Like, you didn't even go to the starting line. And so I think we have to apply for the jobs, right? I know when I crossed over into healthcare early in my career, it was, I remember the director at the time, because you don't know what happened before you get to the interview stage, right? So I had gone through a headhunter. And so it was like, what had happened before I got there was she had interviewed multiple people, nurses, phlebotomists, you name it, right? And just wasn't finding what she needed. And what she was looking for was someone with strong business skills. And what I was coming out of was a role where I was the national sales manager, and I had started up a new inside sales team, and all of these things. So I had those capabilities. I wasn't a phlebotomist, I wasn't a nurse, right? So she took a chance on me because I put myself out there and I had applied for the role. So kind of remember earlier I said I was kind of always that out of the box, I don't fit the mold, not kind of typical. And I've been that way my whole life. Another story, the three brothers I told you about that I grew up with used to say, you're so irritating, Lilliette, because you're purposely doing the opposite to bug me. They would say, I say black, you say white, just to be different. So it's been a theme and a tendency for me. Like, I've always kind of just been a little bit awkward. And so to me, it's kind of when you are willing to kind of be a little bit more bold and vulnerable, not necessarily follow the flow of everybody else, and you remain that sort of authentic self, it makes you unique, right? And so you might end up having that scenario that I explained where I don't know what happened well before me. They had interviewed their very typical candidates, and eventually, it's a numbers game, I was the atypical candidate. And I'm the atypical candidate now in the role I'm in. I came out of healthcare, and I'm in a role where they've always hired people in their industry. My last role in the IT division of the healthcare organization, they always hired IT people, and I was the atypical hire for that role. So that's been my theme, and it's helped me because, again, through the numbers game. So put yourself out there. And I think when you understand that sort of uniqueness in you, it becomes magical, right? Because it becomes just you. So maybe, just dare to kind of be a little bit outside of what would be a typical path sometimes. So that's kind of a long way to get there, but
I love that though. I mean, so meaningful. And really, I think it's it even comes down to that idea of, when you're showing up for interviews and you think, I ought to be this kind of person. I ought to behave this way. What questions should I ask? All of those kinds of things. It's like, well, what are you interested in knowing? Like, what are the things you really want to know? What do you want to make sure that they see about you? Those types of things, rather than how should I perform so that I fit the bill for what they think, is the ideal hire. Yeah. Because if you don't let that uniqueness show, how do you stand out? But also, how do you know that it's a fit for you if you're not showing who you are and that sort of thing as well? So
definitely a balancing act. And I think we're kind of evolving as we are, looking at better ways to retain talent, better ways to harness potential, like all these things that have been happening. So, go back 10 years where, maybe we weren't there yet, right? We were evolving, and, you maybe had to, fake it a little bit till you made it a little bit, right? So there was some element of that. And I think now we're realizing, as we study neuro and leadership together, and that authenticity, and that being awkward is cool, or that little bit of a rebel, and all these things that we've got to learn how to better lead and manage, or harness rather, not manage. I think we're seeing more opportunity to sort of relax and allow that to happen, and how important that diversity in thinking and approach is to really, moving the needle in innovation and so on. So, I think we've definitely evolved now versus, I don't know if I would have given that same advice 10 years ago, because maybe you would have been seen as difficult and maybe not a right fit. And now we're learning differently. And so, yeah, it's definitely the advice I would give.
And any hiring managers that are watching this video right now, this is important. Recognize that it's the person who looks the same as every other person who's ever had this role isn't necessarily what you want. Look for that hire that might be a little outside of the box, right? And maybe 40 bullet points are not really what's needed on that job description. That's fantastic. So if I could, if I have a time machine, this is my favorite question to ask at the end of my interviews. But, if I have a time machine and you can go back and you can either do something over again, or you can go and actually have a conversation with your younger self at any point, and give advice or mentorship to your younger self, what would you do? And what would that look like?
I'd probably say, relax, get out of your own way, girl, because I was always really in my own way, right? There's always room for one more. It's not a competition. And when you work on yourself, bring someone else along with you.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Thank you so much. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to make sure that we talked about today?
No, you know what? I think we covered off a lot, right? I think there's so much, to talk about. We talked a little bit about, race and women together, and just even, going back to our childhood experiences and what that sort of brings to the table. But yeah, no, I think we covered off a lot, and I'm super happy that I was able to share and be here today with you, Lisa.
I'm so glad you were. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Lilliette. And thank you all for watching the video and being with us today. If you found this helpful, please make sure to like and subscribe, and subscribe to my channel, Lisa Wylie Coaching, so you don't miss out on any future videos. Please also leave a comment and let us know what was most impactful for you from this video, because we would love to have comments from you. And, I just want to thank you again and have a wonderful day.